everybody, and welcome back to the Climate and Nature Summit. Today in this workshop, we're going to be looking at Ireland's rainforests, a little known part of our country. This summit is happening at the same time as COP27, which is a meeting of a lot of world leaders in Egypt. They're coming together to look at ways that we can help our home, the Earth. One of the things that they will hopefully look at is how rainforests are protected around the world. Very often when we think of rainforests, we think of the Amazon, we think of parts of Africa and Indonesia, where there are tropical rainforests. What many people don't realise is that there are rainforests here in Ireland, and that once almost all of Ireland was covered in what we call temperate Atlantic rainforests. It was said that a squirrel could hop all the way from one coast, from the east coast to the west coast, without setting foot on the ground, hopping from tree to tree. It's a very different story now. So I'm really excited to have you here to learn about Irish rainforests. What we're going to be looking at are who and what lives in our rainforests. We're going to meet a man who has been working really, really hard to protect our rainforests. His name is Owen Dalton, and he lives in this little part of Ireland called the Beara Peninsula in southwest of Ireland, where he's been protecting rainforests there for the last 13 years. Then we'll look at what makes a rainforest and how we can work to help the rainforests in Ireland. First of all, I want you to have a really good look at this picture. I want you to see how many similarities and differences you can spot. Remember to look at the foreground, look at the background, notice as much as you can. You're going to have 30 seconds, and I want you to turn to the person beside you, see how many similarities and differences you can spot. Go. Ten seconds left. Okay, what did you come up with? You might want to pause the video and share with your class what you've come up with. I'm sure that you noticed that this side is much greener and there's a lot more life going on. You can see ivy, lots of flowers and grasses. And this side of the picture, it looks a lot more organised. Both pictures were taken at the same time of the year in the same part of Ireland. This on the left shows us a deciduous woodlands, whereas on the right is a plantation where the trees are planted in straight lines and they're usually planted to be harvested for wood. If you were an animal, which forest do you think you would like to live in? Where would you find more food? And where would there be more things? The west coast of Ireland has really suitable conditions for temperate rainforests. Anyone who lives there will know that it rains a lot, as well as other forms of precipitation such as drizzle, mist and fog. The weather is largely controlled by the Atlantic Ocean, which gives us a mild, wet but stormy climate. What are the seasons here in Ireland? Do you know how they're different in any other countries? How does the forest change throughout the seasons? The changing of the seasons here are what make our forests different to tropical forests. In a tropical forest, there isn't one particular time when all of the leaves fall off the trees. In Ireland, the bare branches in spring let more sunlight get to the forest floor, which allows for an abundance of wildflowers like bluebells, wood anemone, celandine, herb robert, and so much more. Our wet climate allows these ferns and mosses and lichen to grow on trees and on the ground. Storms often rage along the Atlantic, and even though storms don't seem pleasant to us, they can be a really good thing for the forests. It means that lots of branches and even some bigger trees fall to the ground. This dead wood is really important ecologically for the different animals and the ecosystem. It provides food for insects and small animals, as well as homes and shelters for smaller animals. Do you think these trees have been planted when you're looking at these pictures? No, they haven't. They look really different to trees we might have planted ourselves or trees that are planted around our schools. As you'll see, the trees are kind of higgledy-piggledy in the way they grow. They don't necessarily grow straight up, and often they form twisted and buckled shapes. This diversity and wildness is really, really good for the animals and insects that live there. Now, let's take a look at some of the wild mammals that live in these kind of forests. You will spot 5 different creatures in this picture. I want you to pause the video and see if you can figure out who their names in English and or Irish and any other languages in your classroom. What do they eat and what might be a threat to these different animals? So pause the video now and press play when you are ready to find out the information. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you've found all of the creatures. Down here we have the badger. The badger is the biggest terrestrial carnivore in Ireland, meaning a meat eater who lives on the land. It's very secretive and would be very unlikely to see it during the daytime. This is a little wood mouse. The wood mouse is really dependent on the undergrowth and the plants that grow on the ground floor, the ground of the forest. Up here in the tree, we have the pine marten. In Irish, the pine marten is the cut cream, which means the cat who lives in the tree. They're around the same size as a standard domestic cat, and they love to climb trees. At one point, they were very widespread across Ireland, but thanks to rainforests like this, their populations are looking much more healthy now. Deer here, there are 3 different types of deer in Ireland. 2 of them are introduced and 1 is our native red deer. Deer can do quite a lot of damage in forests like this because their populations are often uncurbed. So they love eating young trees and the saplings as the trees start to grow, which means that as the forest grows, if all of the little baby trees have been eaten, there isn't anything to regenerate the forest. The squirrel, which many of us would know, this is a red squirrel, which is a native squirrel to Ireland. One creature that I didn't include is not found in Ireland anymore. This is the wolf, and the wolf has been extinct in Ireland for over 300 years. However, in the past, the wolves would have kept the deer population under control. Some people talk about reintroducing wolves. Maybe that's a chat you could have in your classroom. What would be the pros and cons of reintroducing wolves in Ireland? There are the fact that you need to check them with what you have written down. This is a white-tailed eagle. The white-tailed eagles went extinct in Ireland for over 100 years. But in 2007, the white-tailed eagle was reintroduced on the Beara Peninsula, right beside where this rainforest that we're looking at is. They are massive animals with their wingspan of over 2.5 meters. In 2007, 100 chicks were brought from Norway and reintroduced in Ireland. Initially, there was some opposition. Some farmers weren't that happy. They feared that they might take their lands. But people have come to love and really, really enjoy seeing the white-tailed eagle flying around the skies of Kerry and Donegal. The forest is so much more than just the trees or just the plants or just the animals. It's an intricate web that all works together in what we call an ecosystem. Have a look at these pictures here. What connections can you see between the different plants and animals and insects that are in this picture? Pause the video and we'll check in on it in a minute. Okay, let's have a look. As you know, the insects pollinate the flowers and trees. The trees, when they're in flower, provide a source of food for the insects, and in turn, they pollinate the flowers in the tree. When they pollinate the flower, it in turn turns into a fruit. And then who eats the fruit? Of course, the birds and the squirrel. Here it's a jay, and the squirrel, of course, is a mammal. They depend on fruit from the trees, amongst other things, to stay alive. Over the summer and the autumn, the jay and the squirrel hide away their nuts and fruits that they find. Most of them they will find again over the winter and eat them in the colder times, but some of them will be left behind and of course then will go on to grow new trees, which in turn will provide homes and places to live and more fruits for the animals in this beautiful web of ecosystem. If you'd like to identify some more elements of the ecosystem, pause the video now and the junior classes can look at these silhouettes and the older classes could try to unscramble these birds and trees. Now, we've been talking about Irish rainforests, but what's so special about the Irish rainforest? Let's meet Owen Dalton. Owen Dalton is from Dublin, but he's been living in Cork for the last 13 years, working to protect the native rainforest on the Beara Peninsula. We asked him, what makes a rainforest a rainforest?
Owen Dalton, thank you so much for joining us and during COP27 and being part of the Climate Nation Summit. Really, really, really lovely to have you here. So first question for you is, a lot of students and probably teachers wouldn't realize that Ireland actually has a rainforest. So can you tell us what actually makes a rainforest a rainforest?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'd like to say thank you very much for having me on. You know, it's a great privilege and honor to be invited to talk to you. So very, very briefly, what makes a rainforest is one very, very simple word that that tells you whether you're in a rainforest or not. And it's a bit of a tricky word maybe for some people, but it's important. I can't leave it out. It's epiphytes. So what is an epiphyte? An epiphyte is a plant that grows on trees, and there's lots of different types of epiphytes. It's really any kind of a plant that grows on a tree without being rooted in the ground. So ivy, for example, is not an epiphyte because while it grows up a tree, it's rooted in the ground. So the kind of things that are epiphytes, they're often things like mosses and ferns, but also other plants, flowering plants, and so on. And you'll see them growing on trunks and branches and so on. And they can only survive because they're not rooted in the ground. They can only survive in places, in forests that get very high levels of rainfall, but also even more importantly, that rainfall arrives on a very frequent basis. So, and it's not just rainfall is perhaps the wrong word, because it also includes, I should probably really say precipitation, because it includes things like mist and fog and drizzle, or any kind of water that falls from the sky essentially will work, so long as it comes often enough and in large enough amounts. So whether you're in the Amazon or the Congo or Indonesia or West Cork, you'll know you're in a rainforest if you look up, and on the branches of the trees, they'll be draped with mosses and ferns and all sorts of other plants growing on the trees. So that's how you know whether you're a rainforest or not.
So were you listening? How do you know when you're standing in a rainforest? Owen just told us you'll see lots of epiphytes. So which one of these is an epiphyte? The one on the left or the one on the right? Shout out the answer. You've got 3 seconds. Very good. Okay, so I hope you managed to get that. It's the one on the left. It's a fern. So can you explain why that's an epiphyte and the ivy wasn't an epiphyte? You've got 10 seconds for this. Talk to the person beside you. I hope you got it. So the reason this is an epiphyte is because it's actually growing on the branch of a tree. If something has its roots in the soil, and it grows up the tree, it can't be an epiphyte. Epiphytes don't have their roots in a soil. They can grow on trees because of the moist conditions in the rainforest. Well,
this map shows the location of temperate Atlantic rainforests around the world. If you have time, you could get your atlas and try to figure out which different countries might have temperate rainforests in them. This other map shows where tropical rainforests are found in the world. But if you look at Ireland, Ireland is completely green on this map. However, we all know that Ireland isn't totally covered in forest. Let's ask Owen Dalton what he thinks about this.
Oh, if you were to get in a time machine and go back to go back several thousand years, most of the west coast of Ireland and other parts of our island that get very high levels of rain and other types of moisture, they would have been covered in rainforests. Now, what happened to that rainforest? Well, the main thing that happened really was that farmers arrived and they had cattle and they started clearing the forests. Now, people often think that they probably cleared the forests by cutting them down, and there may have been a bit of that. But I think it would have been extremely difficult to clear a forest with stone axes. So my thinking is more along the lines that one of the things that cattle and sheep and goats do, all livestock, what they do is they eat all of the plants that are growing at kind of ground level or just above. And that includes small trees, tree seedlings as they're called. And if a seedling gets eaten, it dies and it doesn't grow into a big tree. Whereas if it wasn't eaten, it has the possibility of growing into a massive big oak tree over 100 years or whatever, and then living for another few hundred years. Now, if you have grazing animals like cattle and goats and sheep that are preventing that from happening for long enough, the forest will die out because it's not reproducing itself. And as the older trees get old and die, and there's nothing to replace them, the forest just fades away, essentially.
Okay, time for a quick quiz. What fraction of Ireland used to be covered in native woodland? Question 2. What fraction of Ireland is covered in native woodland? And what fraction of Ireland is covered in plantation? That's non-native or managed forests. Answers. The fraction of Ireland that used to be covered in native woodlands was 8/10 or 80%. The fraction of Ireland covered in native woodland now is 1/100 or 1%. And what fraction of Ireland is covered in plantation? That's non-native or managed forestry, like culture forests for wood. That's 1/10, so 10% of Ireland. How did you do? Well done.
Time just to talk about who is actually Owen Dalton. How did a Dublin man find himself in Cork, and what is your own link to these grazers that you've spoken about?
Well, as you say, I'm from Dublin, but in 2009, I sold my house in Dublin, and the family moved down to the Beara Peninsula in West Cork. We bought a farm down here of 73 acres. Now, a lot of that land was commonage, which is mountain land that you share with other people. But a lot of it, most of the rest was actually rainforest. And now I didn't know it was rainforest at the time. I just saw these absolutely beautiful trees and forest on the land, and I fell in love with it. And that's what attracted me to it. Over time, though, after a few years, I started to realize what it was, that it was actually rainforest. And I was really amazed and delighted to discover that. But unfortunately, the forest was in the same state as I've just outlined to you now, just like most pieces of native Irish forest, it was completely wrecked. So you had feral goats and sika deer were eating all of the native vegetation from about head height down. Almost no vegetation apart from mosses and so on. So all of the trees weren't regenerating. That was the first thing. A whole layer of the forest was completely missing. So a natural forest is full of wildflowers and other very special plants that only grow in the particular conditions created by natural woodland, and they were all just missing. They weren't there. They were, as I said, the whole place was completely stripped bare. So what I did, I applied for a grant under a scheme called the Native Woodland Scheme. That they funded a fence to go around most of the forests to keep the goats and the deer out. Now that took about a year and a half to happen, and in the meantime, I was going around getting rid of the rhododendron and all of the other invasive species in my spare time. Because after a year and a half, the deer and goat fence went up, and they were fenced out, and the whole place absolutely just exploded with life. It was just the most amazing thing to see this. There's been a bit of hard work involved, all right, but it's been the most incredible thing just to see all of this happen, and the way the forest has come back to life as a result of fencing out the goats and deer and getting rid of the rhododendron and other invasive species.
I mean, that's a really kind of hopeful message. I think if we protect nature and leave it be, it can
Okay, 2 quick questions. Firstly, what steps has Owen taken to improve and protect his forest? And secondly, what can make it difficult for the forest to regenerate? Take 2 minutes to chat to the person beside you about this, and then I'll discuss the answers. Okay, so Owen has done a lot to help the forest to regenerate. Some of the things he mentioned were building a fence around the forest area to keep certain animals like deer out. And then he's removing invasive species like rhododendron, which can overtake other native species and crowd out the smaller species, not giving them enough light. And then what can make it difficult for the forest to regenerate? Owen spoke of feral, which are wild goats, sheep and deer that tend to graze too much of the smaller plants, and of course invasive species. Well done. When we were chatting to Owen Dalton, we asked him if he had any tips or advice on what we could do, how we could make a difference in relation to Ireland's wildlife. These were his tips. Firstly, he said knowledge is power, and that's what we're doing here. We're trying to find out more about the rainforests. He said, find out as much as you can about rainforests or any other habitat that's near you. Number 2 was to start making a fuss about it. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk to your teachers. Make sure as many people know about it and tell them that you do care about protecting our native wildlife. Find out about groups who are working to protect native forests. Look at the Native Woodland Trust, Home Tree, the Irish Wildlife Trust. There are loads and loads of organisations now who are working really hard to protect forests. Maybe you could do a project on some of them. Talk to your politicians. Nobody is too young to start. Ask what they're doing about protecting our forests and tell them what you want. And then the most importantly, I think, is find your local forest, find your wild areas, find the little bit of wildlife that is around your school. Look out for those epiphytes and get outside and enjoy the wonderful wildlife we have here in Ireland. Well done, and thanks so much for listening.